Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
So welcome to another ChrisMartenson.com podcast. I am your host, of course, Chris Martenson, and today we are talking with the Honorable Robert C. McFarlane, whose list of distinguished accomplishments is simply too long to list. A few of the highlights are that he served 2 tours in Vietnam and as a special assistant for national security affairs under President Ford, as a deputy national security advisor and counselor to the Department of State under Reagan, as a special representative to the Middle East, and then as Reagan's national security advisor. After his retirement from public service, Mr. McFarlane founded his own company, Global Energy Investors, a developer of energy infrastructure projects in Asia and South America. And in 2000, he co-founded and chaired Energy and Communication Solutions, LLC, which focused on projects in the former Soviet Union, Turkey, Eastern Europe, and other emerging market countries. He serves currently as chairman of McFarlane Associates Incorporated, a consulting firm focusing on advancing technologies in the national security and homeland security domains, and he serves on numerous boards. He now devotes a great deal of his time both to peacemaking efforts in the Middle East and efforts to promote alternative forms of energy with the goal of reducing U.S. reliance on foreign oil. Welcome, Mr. McFarlane. It's really wonderful to have you with us today, and very timely, I might add.
Well, good morning, Chris. It's a pleasure to join you.
Well, thanks, and we're really keen to talk with you today, especially given your impressive background in both national security and energy, and doubly so given the backdrop of the social and political unrest in the Middle East that's now underway. Before we go there, I was hoping you could provide us with a sense of the work you're doing now and continue to do in assisting nations both with their peacemaking and energy infrastructure situations.
Well, first of all, I am working at the request of the government of Qatar, a Persian Gulf state, that has volunteered to be the honest broker between the government of Sudan and the people of Darfur, who, as you may know, have gone through a devastating 7 years of destruction of villages and the infrastructure. Well, I've been coaching the Darfur rebel leaders, first getting them all on the same page about what they'd like to achieve, and then helping them negotiate in the formal process with the government of Sudan in Doha, in Qatar. And we've been doing that for about 2 years, and I'm cautiously optimistic, as diplomats say, toward having a new Darfur peace agreement within about the next 6 weeks. And at that point, we'll enter the really hard part, which is how do you rebuild villages, roads, electricity, water, telephones, things like that for about 7 million people in Darfur.
Well, that's incredible work, and I assume that you have a bird's eye view of what's going on somewhat in the Middle East compared to a lot of folks. So what I want to talk about, though, today really is the United States, its energy policies, and especially its energy risks. So you've had an intimate insider's view of the geopolitical realities of both energy and the policies that are developed and administered. Speaking specifically about petroleum, if we could, what do you see out there? What are the geopolitical risks that have your attention right now? And how would you assess the United States in its current position against those risks?
Well, we are reliant upon foreign oil to really run our entire transportation sector. Cars, light trucks, aviation. About 97% of how Americans get from one place to another is on gasoline. Well, there are 3 problems with doing that. First of all, as you say, there are periodic threats from the Iranian government to disrupt flows in and out of the Persian Gulf. Well, as a practical matter, they couldn't sustain that kind of interruption. But even for a short period of time, you would have oil trading at $200, $250, $300 a barrel, with corresponding increases in the price of gasoline to you and I at the pump here in the United States and throughout the industrialized world, the entire world for that matter. Well, even though we could restore those flows, the damage that would do to the global economy, probably first with the government of Japan that imports about 90%, well, more than that, of their energy needs. But the domino effect would affect the entire global economy and lead to massive unemployment and in short, a disaster for humankind. A second risk, however, that is more plausible that on a sustained basis is an attack on one of the refineries in Saudi Arabia that process between 4 and 6 million barrels a day, and that is feasible. To drive an airplane into one of those refineries or a conventional ground attack, which was attempted about 3 years ago and came within about 50 yards of taking 6 million barrels off the market for the better part of a year. Well, if you do that, you would have oil at about $400 a barrel and corresponding tripling of gasoline prices here at the pump in the United States. But, Chris, what worries me most about our reliance on foreign oil is that when we ship $400 billion a year overseas to pay for the oil that we import and send it to OPEC, countries that in many cases don't think well of us, that money is partially siphoned off to fund al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda affiliates. In short, we're really funding both sides of the war on radical Islam, and that doesn't serve anybody's interest. Finally, the shipment of that much money overseas every year is beginning to be recycled. That is, through sovereign wealth funds in countries in the Persian Gulf, that money is being used to literally buy America. Thus far, companies whose names you recognize, Merrill Lynch, 20% owned by foreign sovereign wealth funds, and over time, that pace of buying up American companies and buying up lobbying firms to influence American policy is going to continue at a very high rate. The good news, however, is that there really are solutions to enable us to get off foreign oil, and maybe I'd better pipe down for a while and let it be your interview, not mine.
Well, that's fine. I'm just listening with ears wide open because something that I follow very closely from the oil side is the geological risks. Of course, I'm a big believer myself in something called peak oil, which is the idea that it's a finite substance, and like anything that's finite, it'll run out. And there's plenty of warning signs in the data as we currently see it today to suggest that there are major issues in the supply of oil. Now, again, this is about flow rates. It's not about total amount we might be able to get out. Advanced technologies can help, but the flow rates are really starting to, for whatever sets of reasons, they've been absolutely dead flat since about 2005, which many take to be a sign that we are at that plateau where we're kind of up against the limit. And the thing that concerns me the most here is that when I look at the United States and its current energy position, I don't see a plan B. I see a plan A, and plan A is we're going to have access to as much oil as we need at reasonable prices. And as long as plan A is in effect, I think we have a reasonable shot of growing our economy and moving forward. But if that does not prove to be true, I have great concerns about what that implies because, one of the things that I looked for after seeing a presentation was the idea of what do we have in terms of planning in this country for a liquid fuels emergency? As you mentioned, 97% of our transportation is happening because of liquid fuels, and almost all of that, except for a little bit of ethanol. That's petroleum, it's oil, it's gas, diesel, all of that. Well, in what I'm really interested in probing from your perspective, what you see in terms of our energy policy and whether we do have a plan B that I've just been missing or what the risks are of our current configuration, given that oil might somehow become of limited supply, whether that's for a geopolitical set of risks or it's a geological set of realities, either of those, same end result as far as I'm concerned. What are your thoughts there?
Well, your added point, and that is that oil really is finite and someday is bound to run out, is a very, very timely point because in America we have lapsed into a kind of a false sense of security with announcements that point to things like the Bakken field, to shale oil, to renewed drilling in the Gulf and so forth, and to feel relatively complacent about this finite risk, about peak oil, about oil running out. And in fact, when you look beyond the headlines, there's no real basis for complacency at all. The Bakken field may indeed prove to be a huge windfall, but this is, as you know, geologically, a difficult formation to develop. Not at all a predictable flow of significant reserves yet. Someday that may happen. It certainly is not within reach, I don't think, in my lifetime, perhaps not yours. And so the announcements, the hopefulness of oil companies about additional reserves, about more drilling, about offshore drilling, Atlantic and Pacific, and the North Slope may indeed someday materialize. However, even if they do, Chris, we're talking about literally no more than 3 to 5 years of our supply before these reserves are exhausted. And that is an optimistic case. And so we have to simply look at what are the alternatives. And at that point, there really are several ways we can tackle and solve this problem, and we can get at it to a minute. I should have mentioned also that we do have a strategic petroleum reserve that is designed to enable us to weather crises such as an oil embargo, as we faced 35 years ago. However, that strategic petroleum reserves will only get us through about 6 months, and that has never been tested and is not a certainty in anybody's mind that we have the planning and means of implementation to assure that. But 6 months is not a long time. Knowing that that's a finite period will still spike the price of gasoline. In short, that's at best a finger in the dike. We need long-term solutions, and let's get into that. I'll take your questions in the order that you think appropriate.
All right. Before we get into the solution space, I'd like to return back and really try and understand what the risks are, particularly in the Middle East. We've got obviously Tunisia, unrest unfolded and went into Egypt, and now there's, in Bahrain, it looks like there's some issues there, and so on and so forth. In your mind, is it just a matter of time before we experience an interruption in the Middle East to oil supplies because of some form of trouble or unrest? Or is this something that you think is a reasonably well-contained risk at this point?
Well, I don't think it is contained at all. Al-Qaeda has two goals. The near-term goal is to bring down the regimes of the Middle East, the monarchies in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf sheikdoms that they see as corrupt and therefore deserving of being turned out. Second goal, however, once they are in control of the very substantial reserves of oil that these monarchies have, is to bring down the global economy and to put in its place the so-called caliphate, or essentially an extreme radical Islamist governance of the entire world. Well, bringing down even one or two of those refineries would enable them to do that, or being in control after they remove or displace the government of Saudi Arabia would make that possible. So Al-Qaeda is committed. It has the financing. It has the means, which are not terribly complex, as I've described, on how vulnerable those oil refineries are. In short, it could happen. I'm a little surprised it hasn't already happened. But I think, too, we have to look hard at what if nothing happens. We are living with a cartel that has the means at hand to determine the price of gasoline and oil throughout the world today. And that's the best case situation from their point of view. It's interesting to note that we cannot look at OPEC as at all a market-driven organization. A market supplier supplies in response to demand. Well, as a practical matter, OPEC is producing the same amount of oil today as it did 37 years ago. It isn't reacting to increased global demand by increasing production, for indeed, it is in their interest to limit demand to increase their own profitability and keep a stranglehold on the global economy and thereby influence the policies of governments that are reliant upon gasoline to run their economies. So we are very vulnerable to the whims of OPEC governance. They are very conscious. Indeed, they have already, in the 70s, had one embargo that did huge damage to our own economy as well as that of industrialized countries in Europe and the Far East. So, yes, there is a definite, persistent risk, either of violent disruption or of whimsical political interference that drives the price of oil up as the governors of OPEC wish to do.
So I agree, these risks are there, and potentially they've always been there. You mentioned, of course, there was an event where a number of people in Saudi Arabia with a car, I believe it had explosives in it, tried very hard to get into a refinery, didn't quite make it. We had another event, I think about a year and a half ago, where a Japanese oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz was attacked by a small ship with explosives that dented the side pretty considerably, just failed to pierce the hull. But of course, we've had many of these near events, and the thing a lot of people I don't believe really truly appreciate is that oil infrastructure is actually quite fragile. A refinery, if you've ever looked at one, I think you can appreciate with all the tubes and pipes and everything. Pipelines, thousands of miles long, very hard to defend every inch of those. So it's entirely possible and probable in my mind that sooner or later some group is going to be able to disrupt that supply. And to me that seems like it's more probable than not. And so therefore we should have some really solid plans for what we're going to do should those risks ever come to pass. And I just don't see that planning yet, or at least if it exists, it's not being communicated well. And I study this very closely. I'm looking at all the policies. I scour the budget for what our energy policies are here in the U.S. And I don't get the sense that I'm on the same page with the people who are making policies today about A, the assessment of the actual nature of the threats, or B, even that it's just inevitable to me, sooner or later, we're going to have a liquid fuels emergency by one of these many things that we've described already. That could be the whimsy of OPEC. It could be due to actual focused efforts by certain groups to interrupt that flow. It could be due to political considerations. It might even be due to the fact that China just outbids us for the next 3 fields that come online. All of these are stack up in my mind to an almost near certainty that sooner or later we have an issue. And my question to you then is, what do you see us doing about that right now?
Well, Chris, I wish I had a more hopeful answer for you. You've nailed it. We really are very likely to face either a disruption violently or a political decision by OPEC to change the price of oil dramatically to $200-300 a barrel and literally destroy the global economy. Now, when that risk was first acknowledged back in the early 70s, when the Arab oil embargo was in place, that drove the price of oil to triple what it had been, people began to gather and in Paris ultimately formed something called the International Energy Agency. And this body brought together industrialized countries to wring their hands and to try to come up with responses. And they ended up basically forming a commitment, kind of a commitment by individual countries to create oil reserves, the strategic petroleum reserves. But as a practical matter, as these steps began to be taken, OPEC could see the ultimate direction that could somewhat counter their control, and so they lowered the price of oil. And the reserves themselves today wouldn't come anywhere near solving the demand that we have in our country, or more than 20 million barrels a day we consume in this country. And so we're still left without a serious game plan for how would we cope if we faced a disruption or a dramatic spike in the price of oil. We simply got to look hard at getting ourselves off oil, at developing alternatives, and having sufficiency, security that we can manage and not be vulnerable to the vicissitudes of political judgments in Saudi Arabia or to violent disruption of oil flows around the world. We simply have to become self-reliant in our energy demands. Without it, our economy craters in a matter of weeks.
It's a just-in-time economy. Everything must flow, and it must flow smoothly, or it does poorly. And we've already seen that in play. Actually, I realized I misspoke before. I painted with too broad a brush when I said that it didn't look like our government had really begun responding yet. It's not true. The military actually has. I was at a presentation recently where a vice admiral stood up and said that they'd performed their usual annual joint operating environment threat assessment, and Peak oil's right on the radar, and the military is developing algae-based biofuels. They're testing them out already. They see it coming. And in fact, if I could paraphrase what this gentleman said, he said that the military is actually standing up, waving its arms, wondering where the civilian branch of the government is on this particular thing, because they see a threat. It's real. It's credible. They're already taking what steps they can to mitigate those risks, as they should. So really, I guess I need to say and qualify it and say that it looks to me like the civilian side of our government hasn't quite caught on to this yet, and I'm just really mystified as to why that is, because this threat isn't like this isn't just another election where you might lose a couple of seats in the House. This cuts right, as you mentioned, right to the very foundation of how our entire economy operates, which means our position in the world, our way of life, our standard of living, our hopes, our dreams. It's literally everything. So I'm wondering how something that big is that far off the radar screen.
Well, it is a lack of political courage for people in the Congress and the presidency to take the difficult steps that we must take to solve this problem. The problem in getting them to do that is worsened by OPEC's own initiatives. Whenever they see us doing something that might be sensible, they will produce more temporarily, lower the price of oil, and reduce the incentives for members of Congress or the president to do what we must do, either in the way of a gas tax or opening our market, which is now controlled by a monopoly of gasoline only. We're not allowed to have any alternative fuel currently. But our congressmen, our president, are relieved of the responsibility when they see the price of oil go back down through whimsical changes on the part of OPEC. Well, I was at a meeting not long ago with Senator Gary Hart, a former senator, and he said, actually, we do have an energy policy. It is to rely on heavy imports and about every 6 or 7 years go to war when those imports are threatened. Well, that's a lousy energy policy, which he acknowledged. Instead of putting our military at risk and the lives at risk, instead of having to rely on foreign production, we simply must open our market to alternative fuels, whether methanol, ethanol, electricity, biodiesel. Today, in a very un-American policy choice, we have allowed ourselves to be driven toward a monopoly by gasoline on how we get from point A to point B. How come we don't have an open fuel market to where you and I can go to the pump, put whatever we want in the tank, whether it's methanol, ethanol, biodiesel, gasoline, or electricity, and not be so vulnerable to reliance upon a single fuel, 2/3 of which is imported from governments that don't like us very much.
That's an excellent point, and it goes even a little bit further than that. I'm currently thinking about getting another car. I would love to get a diesel car like I was just driving in it when I was in Europe last. They've got all kinds of diesel options. We don't have those options because for whatever sets of reasons, we don't sell those cars here. So in Europe, you can buy cars that go 50, 60, 70 miles per gallon. Here, you're lucky if you can get something that'll go 30, 40, maybe 50 at the outer end. So we even limit the free market choices we might otherwise have on the technology side. It's a bizarre situation. So I want to turn to the solutions now, and because I really want to know what we could do. So perfect world, you get to wave a magic policy wand and it happens. What should we be doing right now?
Well, the first thing, possibly the easiest thing that we could do to provide a competitive market for fuels, a choice in what you and I do when we drive up to the pump, would be for the Congress to mandate that any car in the United States that's sold be capable of burning alternative fuels, methanol, ethanol, gasoline, biodiesel. In short, however, the point is eliminate the monopoly now in place where gasoline is the only thing you can burn. Well, we are working on that. I spend a lot of time pro bono explaining why this would benefit everyone to members of Congress right now, and the only real pushback I get from congressmen and women is that, well, isn't that the government picking winners and mandating that you be able to buy these several things? And I point out the obvious. if you do nothing, you are truly mandating a monopoly. If that's not un-American, I don't know what is. And if you look at how this has been done in other countries, notably in Brazil, where today 80% of cars and trucks produced in Brazil are flex fuel. And a person driving up in Rio or Sao Paulo to fill up their tank can make a choice purely based on self-interest. They can burn ethanol, E85, or they can burn gasoline, depending on the price. We ought to be able to do that here in the United States. And the interesting thing is that I mentioned 80% of the cars and trucks on the road in Brazil are flex fuel. They're all produced by Chrysler, Ford, and GM. So this is not introducing some new cutting-edge rocket science. It's putting a $100 kit into every new vehicle. The kit enables you to have a different fuel line and a chip that basically determines what do you have in the tank, what mixture of either ethanol and gasoline, methanol, whatever, and adjust the carburation and spark to do the proper ignition on that. And it works beautifully. In Brazil, they're extremely happy with this. They're not worried about disruption of oil or gas. They could weather that storm because they have alternatives and an open market. We can do that. Today, I'm working with Jim Woolsey, former head of the CIA, to see what it would really take to transform our transportation industry to be reliant upon an open fuels competitive marketplace. Jim is kind of a living example of how to do this down at the individual family level. He has 3 vehicles because he lives on a farm, and he doesn't use 1 drop of petroleum-based fuel. He has 2 hybrid cars, and because he only drives them less than 30 miles a day, he never gets to use, or he never has to use gasoline. He comes home at night and plugs them in. They recharge, and he continues his commute every day, costing about 1/3 what it would cost if he were using gasoline. He's using electricity. But he also needed a farm vehicle. He needed a pickup. So he went shopping, and he found that a 97 Dodge will use unmixed biodiesel, that is, diesel that is not reliant upon any petroleum-based product. In short, Jim Woolsey is driving 3 vehicles, he and his wife, not using 1 drop of petroleum-based fuel. That's the kind of attitude and transformation we have to achieve in this country, and it starts by opening the market so that it's no longer a monopoly held by gasoline and OPEC alone, but anybody that can produce cellulosic ethanol, biodiesel, methanol, or gasoline can compete, and the lowest price is going to win. If that is done, if the Congress can muster its strength and do that against the pressure of the resistance of the oil lobby, we can this year begin to draw investment into putting up the infrastructure for ethanol pumps, E85 pumps, methanol being produced from biomass or coal or natural gas, probably not coal actually, and end up within 2 to 5 years with a production level of the alternatives to where you and I really would have a choice when we drive up to the pump.
Right, and today I have absolutely no choice at this point. And in fact, we're a little worried on our end that they're going to put us to E15 when I don't think my car is quite ready for it in terms of the fuel lines and other pieces like that. So in my studies, I look at this energy transitions like the ones you're talking about. They take a long time, and I think most people underappreciate the amount of investment and just the time. So for the sake of argument, we've got all this shale natural gas, shale bed natural gas. We want to run on it. Well, that's wonderful, but before we can, we have to first outfit and retrofit a whole lot of cars to run on it. Then we have to bring pipelines to new parts of the country so that we can distribute the stuff, get it into new tanks that are being held at fuel filling stations, and then all new, fueling technologies there so we can do that safely. It's just going to take time. My concern is that I think we'll start to get serious about this when we experience our next energy crisis. But of course, that's not the optimal time to be trying to do things. You really want to put your horses in the barn well before you actually have to do that. So. What do you think is the likelihood of really getting to that point in time in time?
Well, I think that there has been enough effort toward education and elevating public awareness about our vulnerability, about the national security issues, about the wealth transfer, about the threat of disruption, to where people understand the risk a lot better today than they did 30 years ago. Now, it is true that OPEC can lower the price temporarily to try to get us to go back to sleep and business as usual. But there's enough awareness in Congress that did not exist at any time, as far as I know, in my lifetime, to where a simple one step of opening the market to competition, I think, is feasible to achieve. Now, you're quite right. Let's assume we do succeed and get an open fuel market established. What happens? Well, the first thing that happens is it draws investment interest into building the infrastructure you've described, pumps that pump E85, methanol development from natural gas or biomass. In short, the money won't come into the building of that infrastructure until investors see that there is a real market and that they might actually get a return on their investment. And for that to be true, they have to see, as the case is in Brazil, that suddenly, instead of 10,000 vehicles that are flex fuel, there are 10 million, and then 20, and then 30 million. That's a market, and worth it to put money into building the infrastructure and the processing plants to make ethanol, E85, biodiesel as choices. So it starts by creating a market, and that requires that there be a visible evidence that every car and truck on the road can burn anything. Well, you're right. The average life of a car in the United States is 17 years by the time it goes through the first, second, and third owner. So turning over our vehicle fleet, which is about 250 million cars and trucks on the road today in the United States, it's going to take 17 years. So we have to get started now. The open fuel standard is key to doing that. It establishes a competitive market. It draws investment into building the needed infrastructure, and at least 17 years from now, we're going to be less vulnerable. Indeed, we will be secure against the kinds of threats you and I talked about a few minutes ago.
Right. So if somebody wanted to help bring this about, what's the most effective thing that a listener could do today to really help drive this?
They could write to their senator or congressman or woman and say, I'm concerned about the threat we're facing of disruption or of the wealth transfer or of funding al-Qaeda, and I want you to do one thing. Vote for the open fuel standard. That's the term that describes requiring that every car and truck in America be capable of burning ethanol, methanol, biodiesel, or gasoline. And that will then create this market I've described and get us off a gasoline monopoly and onto a competitive fuel market. So a letter to your congressman or woman saying, vote for an open fuel standard gets us headed in the right direction. We can do this. It's on the shelf. The technologies are not rocket science. We know how to make ethanol out of cellulose. It's proven by several companies, scaled up by several companies. We can do this, Chris.
So this is very resonant with a belief I have, which is that we actually don't need any new technologies to be developed. We don't have to wait for any new understandings to emerge. We actually have all the information and technology we need right now to begin doing the right things. We just need the political will to be there to get this done. And so I'm very interested in promoting the idea that we have to get serious about what the predicament is that we're in. Yes, it's a predicament. It's not a problem. It's not something that we're going to wish more oil to come out of the ground, and it will. It's sooner or later we're going to be facing this. So why not shape our own future by design rather than waiting for it to be shaped by disaster? And it's just a real mystery to me why we don't have more focus around this at this point. So anything I can do or you can do to help promote that is right in the sweet spot of my interests at this point in time.
Well, I'm really glad to hear this. You have a big audience, people who engage online and listen to what you're saying. And if there's one simple step they can take, it's to urge their member of Congress to vote for an open fuel standard. That'll get us on our way. There are other things we can do, but the technology is already proven. We've got a little bit more work to do on batteries that would enable a hybrid car to go farther than 30 miles on a charge. But that will come as soon as we begin to transform both Detroit and the fuels market. There will be a huge flow of investment into these competitive alternative forms of energy. We can do it. We got to get started, or we could face catastrophe.
Very wise words. And on that note, we're going to draw this interview to a close today. I really want to thank you for three things. First, your service to the country. Second, for everything that you've been doing and continue to do, and for your time today. So thank you very much for being with us, and all the best.
Let's stay in touch, Chris. You're doing the right thing. We've got to get this done. We can do it.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
This concludes this podcast by Chris Martenson. To gain further insight into where things stand today and what might happen tomorrow, please visit chrismartenson.com. That's CHRISMARTENSON.com. Please join Chris Martenson next time to continue your journey toward awareness, understanding, and action.